Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Avexia webinar series. Our topic for today is how any patient can test for toxic mold in their home without an expensive inspection. My name is Christopher Chu. I'm the Director of Marketing for Avexia Diagnostics and will be your host for this webinar. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of being joined by an exciting guest, Brian Karr, who will be our presenter for this webinar. Brian, a second-generation indoor environmental consultant, specializes in assisting hypersensitive individuals with complex medical conditions by identifying and addressing mold, mycotoxins, and other indoor pathogens in their homes, leading to significant improvement in their health. As the co-founder of We Inspect and the Dust Test, Brian has become a recognized authority on mold and biotoxin issues for medical professionals nationwide, having assisted over 5,000 hypersensitive individuals in creating healthier living environments. Beyond his consulting role, Brian is dedicated to education within the environmental and health industries and among consumers. He accomplishes this through speaking engagements at international health conferences and industry training symposiums. Additionally, Brian democratizes knowledge through his popular podcast, Mold Finders, radio, and comprehensive training programs that empower both consumers and health practitioners to properly navigate mold and biotoxin issues. Without further delay, I will now turn the webinar over to Brian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Karr, and I am so excited that you made the time to be here for today's webinar, and I promise I am going to make it valuable for you. I am the co-founder of the Dust Test. I'm also the co-founder of a company called We Inspect. We'll get into that a little bit later, but to just set the stage for today, what we're going to talk about is how any patient, anyone that you're working with, how they can test their house for toxic mold, and they're not going to need some super expensive home inspection, right? This piece is very important because a lot of the doctors and the practitioners that we work with, they are working with mold affected patients, and their homes are impacting their health, right? And what we've seen when we have those conversations with those practitioners is that they actually think that exposure is really, really limiting the effectiveness of their treatment protocols. But the one common thing that they all say is, I don't know how to find it. I don't know how to remove it. I don't know how to get a plan put together. Like, how do I even know if this house is causing my patient a problem? And that is the big challenge. And so today, my goal is to kind of give you some background on the core concepts of how all this stuff works and to give you actionable tools and resources that you can use, culminating in an at-home test that kind of wraps all that stuff together, that makes it a very easy option for you to offer your patients to be able to get back really, really informative, actionable information that can then help drive your protocol decisions, but then also help guide that patient on a successful path to heal. So hopefully that all sounds really good. Now, before I get into that, I'm just gonna give you a little bit of background about me. Every day I go into work and I look like this. Well, there we go. I look like that. Took me a minute working out the tech here. Let me kind of walk you through how I got to this point. I didn't wake up and put this suit on, right? I had my own journey. I found out that a lot of people in this industry, especially on the health advocacy side, the practitioner side, they also have their own thing. Nobody's like, I want to go to school and be a mold guy, very few people like, I want to go to medical school and be someone who focuses specifically on mold health, right? Like, that's not normally a thing. Usually what happens is we kind of find our path to get there. And I find that that's the common thread between all of us who help these individuals. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about mine. It started while I was sitting on my bed looking for a job. I had just been laid off. It was 2008. We had the economic downturn. And so I was looking on my job and literally typing in my computer, jobs that will make me feel fulfilled. Like, I literally wrote that in there. Nothing really came up. But while I'm sitting there, I felt something on my arm and I look and there's like a drip on my arm. And then I kind of track it up and I look up to my ceiling and I literally, like, it almost in slow motion, like one of those time-lapse videos, I see little stain, then the little stain gets bigger, 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 bigger on the ceiling. Then the ceiling starts bowing down, 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 down. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing is going to collapse on me. This thing's going to flood my entire room. And so I picked up my computer and I dove off my bed, and sure enough, the ceiling collapsed, a big water main broken my ceiling in my apartment and flooded down, right? So I did what everybody does. I called the landlord and they got it all stopped initially to kind of stop the spread, right? And so that was sort of my origination issue that occurred. In the time after that, I started having symptoms. I started becoming symptomatic. For me, my symptom set was initially brain fog, which you think would be enough to kick your butt into gear, but apparently not. But I think a lot of people have this sort of denial that there's something going on. But anyways, I started like not being as sharp as I normally was, being a little more forgetful. Remember, I was spending a lot more time in my house now, because I wasn't working, right? And so it's almost like COVID happened, but it happened to me like in that sense where I wasn't ever leaving my house. And I start getting worse. Well, at the time I'm dating, who is now my wife, beautiful, amazing wife, Nikki, and her dad, his name is Mark Levy, was one of literally the top mold experts in the entire country. And I kind of had like 2 degrees of separation to him. And so I was talking to her and she's like, hey, what you're describing sounds like what the clients that my dad works with all the time. You should have him like come check out your place. I think you have a mold problem. And that was sort of the light bulb. I was like, I had a mold problem. So did I take her up on that? No, I did not take her up on that. I did not want to meet her dad that way, really. So what do? I do what every other person does. I call my landlord because my landlord owns a lot of buildings and this is their job and they handle this stuff. And I say, hey, listen, I think I have a mold problem. There's a lot of water. I think I have a mold problem. I'm not feeling well. And so they send out their mold inspector. This is a common story that happens all the time, right? They send out somebody, person's in my house for maybe 20, 30 minutes. They take an air sample from the middle of my room. They leave. And 24 hours later, they tell me everything is fine. It's all in your head. You're not, my building is not why you are sick or feeling the way you're feeling, right? And so it was tough. And like, if it wasn't for my wife, I don't know where I would be right now, to be honest, but I was lucky to be in this situation where I could get a second opinion from somebody who really knew what was going on. Well, her dad comes into my place. He's there for 2 hours. I'm in an 800 square foot apartment and he finds all kinds of problems, not only in my room, which I'll talk about real quickly, but throughout the rest of my apartment, right? Now in my room, what's interesting is they came in, they dried out the ceiling right above where the water leak was. I'm sure people have heard similar stories to this with your patients that you guys work with, right? We dried it out. There can't be mold. There's no problem. Here's the problem with water. When you pour a whole bunch of water on a surface like this, it goes that way, right? It's going to pour and it's going to spread. And then when it runs out of surface, gravity is going to take it down. And so that's what happened. It hit my ceiling. It went all the way across my ceiling, got to the end of my ceiling, got to my walls and went all the way down my walls. Found out that my entire room was actually still damp, even though there wasn't one visual sign of water damage anywhere in my room. And I was sleeping in a toxic box for months. And that's what was happening to me. And I share this story because this is what kind of triggered me to get on my new path. I saw what the first person did. I saw what my father-in-law did when he came in, my future father-in-law did. And I was like, I want to do this. Like he helped me so much and I could see like what my life would have been like if he wasn't there. And I just kind of felt like all that stuff lined up and like, this is what I'm supposed to do, right? And so that's sort of how I got started. And then it ends up with me looking like this every single day, walking into homes and finding the hidden mold that makes people sick on a constant basis. I've worked with thousands and thousands of people over the last decade, and We Inspect has really become synonymous with understanding how to actually find these problems and help people get better, as opposed to having inspections that come in and they don't really find the issue, and then it becomes ambiguous if the house is a problem and people don't get better. And this is like this normal cycle, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, of what we normally see. So that's where it started. But then I was like, gosh, I need to do more than this. I just constantly have this feeling that I need to do more and more and more. I can't, like, it's great to go into homes every single day, but like I want to change the world. I want to change how people heal. I want to have an impact on humanity. And so then what I started doing is started creating an entire training ecosystem of education resources, of podcasts, of downloads, of doctor trainings, of patient trainings, all kinds of stuff. And what that turned into was We Inspect collectively being the largest collection of mold education that literally exists anywhere in a unified space on planet Earth right now. And I'm really, really proud of that. But then again, that wasn't enough. It's almost like it's an infomercial. I'm like, oh, wait, there's more. And so this was happening, right? And I was like, okay, cool. We're spreading awareness. We're working now with people from We Inspect all over the country, as opposed to just one local place. During this time, we built out an infrastructure to do inspections, literally anywhere anyone called us. And we'd really been getting towards this goal of helping more people. And then it kind of dawned on me one day, like what the next step really needed to be. And it came from a period of time when I was taking a lot of our front end phone calls of people calling in who were inquiring about our services. And so many of them, they all have the same question. And the questions are, do I have a mold problem? How do I even know I have a mold problem? How do I know I even need to work with you guys if I don't even know I have a mold problem? Because an inspection is an investment, it's a commitment. I don't know if I want to do that yet, right? Like, how do I know that? And so that became a really interesting question. And there are some tests out there that people use to try to help answer that question, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then talk about how my approach or our approach at the dust test was to answer this question. And in our mind, if we're able to really, really effectively answer this question and paint a picture of what's going on, then it allows people to be more educated about the next steps that they take. It allows the practitioners that are treating them to be more effective in their treatments, because what we're going to do is understand if there is even a mold problem without this large financial commitment up front. And so then if they find out that they are being exposed, then we know that the health treatments are only going to go so far if there's a constant exposure, and we can really like work together to figure out how to best support somebody through their healing journey. And so that's what we're going to get into today towards the end of it. But I do want to set the stage a little bit. I'm not, I'm not doing this live. I usually do these things live, so I'm not getting live feedback. So, I want to set the stage just in case there are those of you here watching this today that aren't very mold literate, meaning really truly understanding the impact that environment and mold specifically can have on health. I just want to kind of set the stage a little bit for you and put some context. So I love this photo. I've been using the same slide for like 5 years because I just like it so much. This baseball stadium, there's like tens of thousands of people in here, and over 40% of these people are sensitive to mold and biotoxins. Now, a lot of them might not know it yet, but it doesn't mean that they aren't. And what I looked for here, and the number is actually more than this, that's why it's over. But the way that I came up with this, I literally just looked at 4 different things that we know have a direct tie to mold exposure and impact that condition. First off is CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. We know there's a genetic predisposition of approximately 24% of people that makes them sensitive, like immediately. We know this, right? This research has been put out there, and it's been widely adopted by the functional medicine community as an understanding. But then I look at some of the other like main health issues that people come into our company with. And I just picked kind of the top 3 off the top of my head when I was putting this together. First one was Lyme disease. Second one is autoimmune issues. And the third one was PANS, PANDAS, and children. So we see a whole lot of all 3 of these. And then offshoots of different things, like you see mast cell activation, you see multiple sensitivity, you see all these things, but sometimes they anchor back to one of these 4 things. So when I just went and did some research and put together how many people are impacted by this generally, this is the number that we found. It's over 40% of people in the US. It's over 130 million people are impacted by this on a daily basis. There's so many people here that are being impacted. Many of them don't know. But if we take this piece into consideration, and then we start thinking about what's next, there's a formula. I have to be susceptible to it, but then I have to be exposed to it, right? So if I'm not exposed to it, then it's not going to hurt me, right? And so that's the next piece. We have this epidemic of sick homes and sick buildings, and I don't think that we really understand how significant it is. Now, the EPA says that at least 50% of buildings are water damaged. I am going to tell you that that is like way higher than that number. You got to think of like, what do they mean by water damage, right? Like they're talking big floods and stuff. How could the EPA know every single time there's a leak in someone's house? There's no way that they're going to know that, right? So they're taking like broad information and kind of putting it down. But like, no one's telling them when grandma 20 years ago overflowed the washing machine and it flooded the house and she didn't take care of it properly because 20 years ago, nobody even knew that mold was really a thing. And the next thing you know, you now have mold in the walls and in the floor, and it's permeated the HVAC system, is going through that house because nothing was done from it. And spoiler alert for the future, if it grows and it's not removed, it stays and it circulates. It doesn't go anywhere, right? So you start adding all these things in all the time, and you realize, in my opinion, I would say that this number is not 50. I would say this number is closer to 90%, right? Almost every single house you go into has some sort of water damage, and water is what mold needs to grow. It doesn't need it to stay. It just needs it to grow. And we'll also kind of get to that. I'm like foreshadowing a little bit. But if you put these 2 things together, you have a huge number of people that are impacted by environmental triggers and mold specifically. And then you have almost every single house that exists has some sort of water damage in it. And then you're like, well, Brian, if every house has water damage, then what do we do about that? Like, oh, well, it just is what it is. And I would argue that if something happens so much, sometimes we normalize it. We're like, oh, well, it happens all the time. What we need to do is become hyper aware of that thing and say, listen, I understand that this may happen the majority of the time. So now what I need to do is take that into consideration when I'm evaluating an individual. And if they line up with any sort of the inflammatory markers or tests that are specifically tied to mycotoxins or whatever that you guys are doing to identify a potential mold affected person, then we need to overlay this fact that there is a very high chance that they're exposed to some level of mold in the home. So then the question is, how much are they being exposed to? And at what point is there that tipping point where it's going to impact that individual? The second question is really where you guys come into play. The first question is what we can help with today. And so by working together, we can get a full picture to help guide somebody. So that's sort of what we're working with. That's kind of our situation, right? That's where we are. And I'll finish by saying this, and this is not an exaggeration in any way, shape, or form. Every single time a practitioner refers a patient to us as an inspection company, we find something in their house every single time. I've never met one referral where their doctor said they're being exposed to a mold problem, and I came back and said, sorry, the doctor's wrong. There's nothing here. I've never, ever, ever once seen that. And so I want you guys to know that if you're seeing it, that I want you to lean into that, right? Because I'm telling you, I'm trying to give you some validation that you're right. And so what we need to do is help coach and guide patients and clients to accept that, right? And so as we get into that, I want to talk through what a normal patient journey looks like from our perspective, from what we see and hear all the time, right? And so what happens is somebody gets sick, they're getting, they're feeling their whatever their symptom set is, and like, oh man, I've got health concerns. I need to go see the doctor, right? And they go to the regular doctor. What's the regular doctor say? You have no problems, right? And so this time period, your blood tests look fine, everything looks fine. It must be in your head. And so there's a time lapse that happens here. Sometimes this period can last years. Other times somebody is a little more proactive and they'll be like, I don't believe you. I'm going to go do some more digging and deep diving. And then they figure out what functional medicine is. And then they go find an integrative or a functional practitioner, and that person's looking at their whole body. And now they're understanding what a symptom set really looks like, right? It's multi-system, multi-symptom is a lot of times what ties to environmental exposure. So you have different systems in your body, neurological, reproductive, digestive, whatever, and you have multiple symptoms that are happening in all of those. There's a much, much, much likelihood that there's an environmental exposure going on, and that's the root of maybe what the symptom set is. This is what I've taken from all of my years of speaking with smart people like you. So hopefully this is in alignment with what you have seen as well. And so what happens at this point is the doctor is like, hey, I think you're being exposed to mold. You need a mold inspection. We need to figure out if you have mold. But they don't really know how to guide past that because they shouldn't. It's not their job. It's not your job to know how to diagnose mold, right? You got enough to figure out in the body. Like that's what we're here for, right? And so then you tell them, it's what they do. They go to Yelp, they go here, they go try to figure out and they get an inspection. They don't really know that there's a difference. They haven't heard my story. They haven't heard the guy that came in and said everything was fine. And then like the master Jedi that came in and found all the things, right? They don't know that. They just see a certification on a name and think that everybody's equal, right? And so an inspection comes in, and the majority of time, this inspection will say there's no problem, just like it did in my case. And so what happens then is that the patient then goes back to the doctor, goes back to you, and is like, I had an inspection. They said everything's fine. And you are kind of taking that at its word, right? Again, it's not your job to know how to go through a house. It's not your job to understand if an inspector is good or if they suck. It's not your job to know that, right? And so you kind of have to take that at face value. But the majority of the time, they didn't really have a proper inspection, and there still are problems in their home, but now they think that there isn't one. And this becomes a really slippery slope, because as you start to move down the cycle here, you're trying to do treatments, you're trying to put protocols in, and they might get a little better, but then a lot of times they plateau, and then a lot of times they even fall down and they regress and they come back, and they look at you and they're like, I don't have a mold problem. You aren't doing your job, Dr. Smith. You can't fix me. I need to go find someone else, right? And this isn't your fault. There's this key component in here, right around the bottom, right around local mold inspection here, where if this was swapped out with something different that gave accurate, actionable information, it would change the entire trajectory of the rest of this path. And that's what we're talking about today, okay? Before I get into that real quick, I want to talk through some of these limiting beliefs, some of these myths that cause this local inspection to fail. So you have a general understanding. Again, I don't want you to be an expert on this, but if somebody comes in, they're like, oh, I had an inspector, I'm going to arm you with a few questions here that you can ask them. And if they come back and they answer in a certain way, you say, okay, listen, that inspection, you need to do this test instead. I don't believe this inspection. You shouldn't believe it either. Okay. So here's the first one. The first one is that most homes aren't water damaged. Well, I just walked you through the whole thing. This is the same little picture, just smaller, right? We know that most homes are water damaged. There's leaks under sinks. There's all these different things. You don't need a flood for there to be a mold problem. You literally could have drips in a sink cabinet under a sink that could cause a massive mold problem that nobody ever knew about, okay? Most homes have water damage. It's just a matter of how much. And so if they say, oh, my home's fine, I've never had a problem, that doesn't matter. I'm telling you, it doesn't matter, right? You might not know the problem. It might have happened before you moved in. You might be the first owner that's ever lived there, and you can say, well, that couldn't happen before I moved in, but maybe there's a drip over here that you didn't know about, or maybe your windows are condensing just a little bit and it's causing a mold problem right around your windows that you'd have no idea about. These are all the things that get missed in local inspections. So I want to kind of nip this, that this is not true, right? Most places do have water damage. So we know that that's a component we have to think of. Now, the next one that comes up a lot is that mold stays trapped behind walls. This is what local inspectors will say to validate their way of testing. What I'm going to be telling you is that's completely not true. If all mold stayed behind walls, we know that mold isn't all over the walls in houses. We know this. We have eyes, right? We know it doesn't work that way. If everything stayed behind a wall, then none of our patients or clients would ever be exposed because it would never come out of the wall, right? Like, this is just common sense. Of course it comes out of the walls. And to give you a little context on this, there's something that's called building pressure in a home, right? Every time, for those of you who are listening, I'm gonna ask you to raise your hands, but I'm recorded. But any of you who have ever like opened a door or a window and then heard like a door slam shut, like on the other side of the house, most people will raise their hand to that. What's happening is that you've changed the pressure of your house. And by opening a window to the outside or something like that, you've now changed how air is moving and it's slamming that door shut on the other side of the house. And that's a visual representation of how air currents move constantly in your house. And this is how stuff gets pulled out from behind your walls and how it gets to you, okay? Now, the third thing here is the method that air samples will tell you if there's a mold problem. I'm telling you right now, I told you about my story. I'm telling you about all these other clients I've worked with. This is not true. You put an air pump up in the middle of the room, and we did an internal study. It gave a 78% false negative rate when there was a mold problem behind a wall that was literally 3 feet away. This is how incorrect, how wrong this is. Yet the majority of our industry does this to tell you if you have a mold problem. The quick reasoning, so I don't go super long, is that the further away you get from a mold problem for an air test specifically, it gets exponentially less effective. If I took air from behind the wall, right where I thought there was a mold problem, but it wasn't visible, I could get super accurate results that way. But that's not how local inspectors do it. They come in and they stick a pump over here and they think that it's going to pull everything in, and it doesn't. And then when you get a false negative, it then makes the person, just like it did me, says, oh, you don't have a mold problem. And then they move down the road, or just like I showed you in the chart that we just showed, right? And so what we need to know is we need to be able to redirect. And so the question is, well, how did they test? Oh, they took air samples in all my rooms. Yeah, I'm sorry, you just burned all your money on fire. That doesn't mean anything, okay? And now the last thing is that there must be active water for mold to grow, okay? So now this is not true. There needs to be water for mold to grow. It's like watering a seed. There has to be water for it to be there. But if the water dries out, the mold doesn't go away. It doesn't like gather its children and pack up its bags and go try to find another river to live next to. That's not how it works. It's like a plant. It's like a weed. You water it, you stop watering it, it stays there. And then it starts to wilt up and it starts to become dry and it starts to break apart. And that actually makes the mold problem worse because the entire colony now shatters as air currents blow by it, and it increases the exposure that we have to those things in the house. So arguably these older problems that existed, they could even impact us more than areas that are like actively growing right now. You obviously don't want things growing, but this is so important. And the problem is that a lot of inspectors will come in and they'll just use a moisture meter and an infrared camera. And let's say everything is dry, mold can't be here if it's dry. You're like, yeah, I guess, but I still have grass in my yard, and grass can't be there if there's not water, right? Except look, all my grass is still here and it's dying. So you tell me the difference, right? And that's exactly what's going on. And so as I was putting this presentation together, it's like I was looking for quotes and stuff because I wanted to like cement it in. And then I saw this picture of Albert Einstein's face made out of cheese. And I was like, I need to use this picture. So then I started looking for quotes from him, and I found this, and I thought this was really cool. I never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking. Everything I just showed you is the rational thought process in our industry. Most homes don't have water damage. Air samples are great. You know, you only need water. It needs to be wet right now if there be a problem. All of these things is what the industry thinks. And this is why people get misled. And this is why we need testing that can offset all of that stuff and just tell us for real what's going on, right? Now, I told you don't have to be an expert. And I mean it, right? So for the last few minutes here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how to test and what it looks like and how the dust test builds into this. So the first thing I want to talk about is dust in general. Dust is literally the ultimate screening source for us to be able to understand what mold exposure looks like in a house. There's a few reasons for this. Number one, it is the most reliable sample source. As opposed to an air sample in the middle of the room where you're just kind of dependent on whatever's floating around in the vicinity of this thing, dust, it retains, it holds things for periods of time. Just think of this, like you pick up dust and there's like food in it and there's insect fragments in it. It's all this stuff. It acts like a spider web almost and it catches everything. So if you have mold particles floating around and then gravity brings that down, it gets in the dust and it gets held up there and it holds there. And it allows us to collect dust and get an incredibly reliable sample source that is not variable based on whatever the air currents are at the time. And it gives us a more accurate read of what's truly been going on in the house from an exposure perspective. So this is where we always go to understand exposure. We don't do air samples in the middle rooms at all. We do dust testing only because for the purpose of understanding what someone's being exposed to. Now, if I'm trying to find mold in a wall, it's different. I'll test the wall different. But if I'm trying to just figure out, is there a problem here? What's exposure look like? It's dust every single time. Now, the other reason that dust is cool is because it's the gold standard of testing, right? You can actually analyze through PCR down to the species level, which is amazing because species can determine the opportunistic nature of that mold, meaning can it produce mycotoxins or not, right? And so if we're talking about toxic mold, you can now connect the dots. Oh, Aspergillus niger is here. We know that produces otrotoxin A. Oh, your urine mycotoxin test in your body had otrotoxin A, and we're seeing high levels of Aspergillus niger. We're now connecting the dots and understanding exposure to body, and that is huge because when you can connect that and show somebody the connection of what's in their house versus your testing, it makes everything work way better. They're more on board with the process. They trust you even more, and you're able to make better decisions on treatment and how you're going to process that, right? And then the last piece here is ultrafine particles. Normal air samples don't do this. I don't want to go on this too hard, but basically a individual mold spore can actually be representative of 500 times that number of spores. So 500 pierced off teeny tiny particles of the same mold type. So a lot of times if you're doing an air test and it says, oh, there's 4 or 5 spores of this, that could mean 50, or what's 500 times 5? 2,500 particles of Stachybotrys instead of 5 spores of it. And we breathe those particles in a lot easier. They can bypass our body's natural filtration system and get directly into our body without being filtered out way more easily. And it can actually trigger all the inflammatory reactions a lot better, or a lot more severely, I should say. So being able to identify down to ultrafine particle size truly tells us what their exposure looks like, and it doesn't downplay it in any way, and that's incredibly important. Now, I want to talk through a little bit about patient profiles of people that we've seen and sort of the thought process of how we need to provide them information to help them get out of their own way to succeed, right? And so we really see 2 different types of patients or clients, you know, when we talk to them. The first one's, and I've heard this, I've spoken with other doctors and they've mirrored this back. You generally have 2 types of people. You have somebody who doesn't believe you, or you have somebody who does believe you. Your doctor goes in and you say, I think that you're being exposed to mold. And they're saying, you're crazy. My home is clean. I have house cleaners and I've never had a flood. I don't believe you. Or you have the believers that are like, yeah, you know, I believe that. I'm so sick. I've been sick for such a long time. I've tried so many things and you're telling me this. I believe you, right? You kind of have one of those 2. And so it's important to understand each of those, what the challenge is and what we need to provide them in order to overcome their belief and where they're at right now, okay? And so the first part is the skeptics. So their challenge is they don't believe they have a problem. So what we need is validation that looks at mold as a key component in their treatment plan, but we need to validate that mold is a thing, right? So you're looking to prove to them, it's a test that's just going to prove to them that there's a mold problem, right? Now, for the believers, what they're trying to understand is like, okay, I believe I have a mold problem in my body. Maybe you did a mycotoxin test, a urine test, and it came back, or a blood mycotoxin test, serum test, whichever one you did. You're like, yes, I believe I have a mold problem. So now the question is it my current home or is it a previous home? Now you're trying to figure that out. And so then what we need to have as an outcome is validation. Is it the current place? Meaning, what does my place look like right now? If my place looks really good right now, then we can surmise that it was maybe a previous place and it will give me guidance on how to move forward. For both of these patient profiles and archetypes, this is where dust testing is so valuable. Now, I'm not sure of those of you watching are familiar with ERMI. This is a pretty standard and kind of what has been the industry standard for dust testing for mold up until now. And ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. What I want to tell you is that ERMI is actually not a test. ERMI is not the data that's coming on the sides over here of all the different molds. That's actually just MSQ PCR mold speciation analysis. ERMI is actually referring to this little score down over here. That's what ERMI is relating to. It's an interpretation, it's an index. And so the problem with ERMI is that the index is flawed. The math is flawed. And because of that, it makes people stay in homes that they shouldn't be staying in because they think their score looks good. This is a perfect example of that. So to give you a quick explanation, on one side you have, quote, water damage molds. On the other side, you have common indoor molds. This is what an ERMI result looks like. For the record, I just want to say every single mold is a water damage mold. So the fact that you're going to say that some are not like water damage molds is already misleading and downplaying all of those molds as a potential to trigger responses in your body. Your body doesn't care how much water it needs for a mold to grow. It's going to react, right? And so the concept of this is already downplaying that. But the way that they come up with a score of minus 2.3, they go over to group 2 over here on the side, and they say, okay, these common molds that apparently aren't molds that would ever impact somebody's health, apparently these are only not as important as the group 1 molds, but they actually devalue the prevalence of the molds on the other side. It's when you think of the math, it's crazy. I was talking to my kid the other day, and I took this and I just gave her an example that she can handle. And I was like, okay, so let's say group 1. On this side, you have 2 apples, okay? And then group 2, on this side, you also have 2 apples. How many apples do I have? And she looked at them and she's like, I put them on the table and she's like, there's 4 apples here. She counted the apples. I'm like, yes, that's how many apples you have. What is not happening is you're subtracting that and ending up with magically no apples, which is what this math does. So really quickly, your minus 2.3 here is subtracting 21.7 from 19.4. It is saying that these molds are negatively impacting. They're reducing the impact of the molds that are present here, and they're giving you a score of -2, which makes you think you're moving into the healthiest home in the world. When really what should be happening is they should be looking at these two together, because mold is mold and you're adding it together and you have a cumulative load that is actually very high. This is a common ERMI that we will see where someone's like, oh yeah, everything's fine. Yet you look and everything's highlighted and there's all these like extra amounts of mold that are there, but because their score is -2, they think everything is fine. And this becomes a major problem for people, right? And so what we ventured to do is we're like, okay, what we need to do is figure out how to come up with a different way to interpret the data to provide an actionable result. And so in doing that, I go back to all the phone calls I said that I was taking for people for so long. And it always came down to these 3 questions. Do I have a mold problem? How bad is it? And what do I do? If I'm talking to them on the phone, those are the 3 questions they ask. So as we were creating the dust test, we're going to use the technology that exists. We're going to sample for the same mold types that exist, but we're going to analyze it in a different way to answer these questions and give people the guidance they really need. And then that's ultimately what the dust test became. It became a test that mold can't hide from, because we're not using math that subtracts it from each other and makes people think that everything is hunky-dory and everything is fine. And so that is what the dust test is. So I'm going to show you real quick just an example of what the reports look like. As you can see, we still have group 1 and group 2 molds that are sitting here, okay? All the same mold species. So it's the same panel. So those of you who are familiar with ERMI, you're not replacing the panel. It's the same panel. So there's a consistency there. What's different here is how we interpret and how we show it. So first off, we're highlighting things in different colors, and we're showing kind of severity based on the EPA study that was the anchor for all of this stuff, okay? So if you look at this thing and you see this thing lit up like a Christmas tree, you know that they have a problem, even before you get into the interpretation piece we're going to talk to later, okay? So this is the first piece. This is the raw data. This part's great. What I want to get into, though, is more about the interpretation of what that looks like, right? Now, do I have a problem? We saw that in the previous one. You have a whole bunch of things that are highlighted. Cool, we answered that question. How bad is it? The how bad is it question is anchored in comparison. It's always anchored in comparison, because how bad is it at the root of that question? Someone's asking, do I need to stay or do I need to move? That's what they're asking when they ask, how bad is it? What am I in for? How bad is it compared to everyone else, right? That's what they're looking at. So what we did is that we combined data from inspections that we did over a long period of time. and we overlaid that information and cross-referenced it on top of the information from ERMIs that were coming through, and we identified a more realistic relationship for understanding and expecting what a house may look like in terms of severity based on what the dust testing samples look like on the front end, what the ERMI tests look like on the front end. And in turn, we created our own interpretation of how to check it out. So the first piece of this is, think of this like a percentile scale. So how your home compares to others, right? You've got your percentiles here. This is what somebody would see. And they'd be like, oh, I'm code 4. So I'm in basically the 51st to 90th percentile of homes, which is where most homes are. The reason this percentile is so big, by the way, is because most homes have water damage and most homes have a mold problem. So just like I said at the top, right? And there wasn't a really discernible variance in the spreads between all the information in here. Am I a code 5? Is it one of the worst houses that are in here? Is it code 1 and one of the better houses? Now I have a context and I don't have a number that's subtracting from its own self and giving me a false read, right? The next thing we do break down a little bit more in the report, how many molds were detected, how many require different amounts of moisture. And that's great and that's awesome and it is useful information. But the thing that's really more useful in this is really understanding the action that you should be taking based off what you're seeing or the action you should be considering. And so I want to show this up because this becomes the conversation around what your results look like, okay? So I'm showing you, here's your code number, here's the ranking percentile, similar to what we have. But let's talk about the meaning here and let's talk about the action, all right? So if you're in code 1, this is the lowest presence of mold. This is considered the closest to a normal fungal ecology. So from an action perspective, if somebody is not really sick, then you probably don't need to dive into this house anymore. What does that mean? You probably don't need a whole mold inspection here if somebody isn't really having health concerns, right? What we've done is we've isolated this place. We said, okay, this exposure piece isn't a huge issue and we're cool with it, right? In group 2, you're in the 10th to 25th percentile. There's a moderate presence of mold here, but it is considered less than we find in most homes. So here, if the health concerns are correlating with the test results, this is really important, meaning I tested my patient for mycotoxins and they have otratoxin A. And in the dust test report, I saw that Aspergillus niger or Aspergillus otris was very high. It was one of the color-coded ones that popped up. I'm now correlating my mycotoxin read inside of my patient to what's in the house. Then you would want to move forward and do further investigation, do inspection of the house. But if you get those results and you're not seeing any correlation between those two, then at that point, it might not be as necessary, right? And so that's a really interesting piece when you look at code 2. Now, when you look at code 3 or 4, this is suggesting that there's multiple sources of mold growth in the home, right? Not just 1 or 2. If you get up to this level, there's multiple things going on in the home. So we would be recommending an inspection at this point, right? And this is what you can help with as well, right? You have a chart here where you say, hey, listen, we should be thinking about an inspection here so we can pinpoint where the problems are. The inspection, the purpose of the inspection, once you get to that point, it's not just say like where they are, but it helps prioritize which ones are worse, and it helps the patient or the client be able to then understand where to focus their remediation to get the biggest impact for the smallest amount of remediation expense. And that's really like the roundabout goal at the end of this. Now, if you get into code 5, this is a higher mold load. There's most likely several sources that are going on. And again, we would still be recommending an inspection, right? So the difference from the dust test from like what some of you may be familiar with on an ERMI is that the dust test interpretation is completely different. And it's geared around answering the questions that patients and clients have, and then ultimately use the practitioner have. Does my patient have a mold problem? How bad is it? And then what should I be doing? Instead of having an ERMI score that comes up that's subtracting 2 apples from apples and telling you they magically disappeared when you set 4 of them on the table. So this gives you actionable, accurate, and affordable information that you can then get to help drive your decisions as a practitioner, but then also help guide your patient as they move through. And that's the dust test. So I'm really excited. I ran a hair long. Hopefully Vexi's not super mad at me. I apologize. But I really wanted to run you through this. You'll be able, obviously, to get the dust test on the platform. Really, really excited for you guys to check it out. I think this is going to be a huge, huge help for anyone who works with any type of mold impacted, mold affected individual, of kind of shedding the secrecy and the confusion around understanding, is there a mold problem in someone's house right now? or not. And if we know that, we can make such better decisions, and ultimately your patient will have a much better experience with you, and they will heal a lot better. And that's what we're looking to try to support you guys with on the end of at the end of the day. Thank you so much for taking time to check this out. We are here to support you guys, to help you guys in any way that we can. And I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that informative presentation. For any questions or issues you may have, please contact Avexia Diagnostics by email at info@avexiadiagnostics.com or by phone 5 days a week at extended hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time at 888-852-2723. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar event. Until next time, from everyone at Avexia Diagnostics and the Dust Company, stay healthy, stay safe, and we wish you all the best on your pathway to wellness.